very different. I knew this man in the 1960s and the 1970s, and he died in the early 1980s. When I was a boy and went to go and stay with him, every night of his life that I can remember that I stayed in his house, he would wake up having nightmares, screaming in the middle of the night. And because he was gassed, it sounded as though it was the screams of a dying man. Needless to say, he didn't sleep in the same bedroom as my grandmother, who fancied a quiet night's sleep. 55 years after, in the middle of the 1970s, at the end of the 1970s, he decides that he wants to tell the true story of the war to someone. And he dictates this account of that very wonderful stunt that he emerged out of untouched to my mother. And this is what he says 55 years later. Led up the battery of A Company, leading B Company on the left, C on the right, D in reserve behind West Hook Ridge. Shelled all night, but mainly directed at support trenches and communications to rear. Assembly trenches full of dead and in a terrible state of confusion with the outgoing battery, who had suffered very heavy casualties and achieved nothing during their previous attack. We went over at dawn, supported by a 1,000-gun barrage, subjected to heavy machine gun fire from pillboxes and concrete forts in Glencorse Wood. Within a few minutes, I'd lost all the men in my platoon, and as they fell, they slid into a swamp about 3 foot deep of mud and water. With my only contact, Platoon Sergeant Mills, we drifted to the left to avoid the swamp, and I picked up a few survivors of the company on the left, and some men from the next division. Tried to make a defence position in a massive waterlogged shell holes. Waited to see what happened on the left and the right. Late afternoon, the Germans seemed to be assembling in small parties to counterattack us. They must have been spotted, and our artillery put down a wonderfully effective barrage in front of us. We could do nothing. Rifles and my revolver were out of action by continuous slides into thick mud and barbed wire. I had to cut off my puttees and trousers to free myself. 2 Jerrys, that's Germans, made for me with their bayonets fixed, but thank goodness they both got a fine burst of shrapnel, which finished them and saved myself and the sergeant plus 1 or 2 of the wounded with us. Basically, he spends the whole night out in the swamp of mud, and the next morning manages to crawl back behind the lines. And he concludes, I led out 108 ORs and found that I was the senior sub with 6 other junior subs, all that was left of the officers. We went in 19 officers and 700 regular soldiers. We came out with 7 officers and 108 regulars. And then they were, as companies often were, at the end of those type of offensive, taken back behind the lines for a couple of weeks. The point here is that this is a man who was haunted by this experience 50, 60 years later, and yet for his parents, he was a hero who'd survived a wonderful stunt. In fact, he went on surviving that wonderful stunt for the rest of his adult life, like so many of the other men that he fought alongside. So, far from becoming imperial heroes, as many British men thought when they volunteered to fight, the experience was one of emasculation, often. Or of not being able to live up to the standards that were expected of them, maybe a kinder way of putting it. The remarkable thing here is that there was very little desertion in the British Army, much less than in the French and German armies. There were something like 50,000 court-martials, 3,000 death sentences for people trying to desert. 346 of them were shot. And about 10 years ago, there was actually an official apology released by the British government, recognising that many of the people shot for desertion had actually been suffering from shell shock. And indeed, these men often returned to Britain crippled and broken. 2 million wounded soldiers returned. 400,000 of them went on disability benefits after 1918. And indeed, a whole new government department is set up to try and calculate what type of benefits people should get for having lost a leg as opposed to an arm, as opposed to a testicle, as opposed to an eye, as opposed to half a face. There was a government department that literally tried to calculate what each organ was worth. And of course, this was the war in which shell shock was discovered. 80,000 cases in the British military, 80,000 cases that basically provided the occasion for the first very gradual and halting acceptance of Freudian psychoanalytic techniques in the medical profession. Most famously, of course, by the war poets, people like Wilfred Owen, who were taken up to this famous prison called Craiglehart up in Scotland to be fixed up through psychoanalytic treatment. Many others were subjected to all sorts of, electroconvulsive therapies and a whole variety of ways in which shell shock was treated. But importantly, it was also the occasion for the beginning of therapeutic methods. I'm going to play you very quickly Wilfred Owen's, the famous war poet Wilfred Owen, poem Anthem for a Doomed Youth, which was written in the fall of 1917 when he was actually a patient up at the Craigle Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh. And my apologies for the fact that it's Kenneth Branagh doing the reading.
Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can batter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds.
Okay, so I have about 20 minutes or so to get through this last section. So, out of the human experience of the war, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the war really punctured this confidence and that had characterised the idea of the late Victorian Edwardian male and their role in the national and imperial endeavour. Now what I'm going to talk about is basically how the conditions of total war also decisively checked the key characteristics of liberal political economy and government that has developed in the 19th century. And I'm going to do this under 3 headings. I'm going to talk about what happens to the economy, the war economy. I'm going to talk about the introduction of conscription, and I'm going to talk about the management of the dead. All of which is designed to show you that the state basically takes centre stage. Now, you'll remember, if you don't remember this by now, just throw up your hands in defeat for the midterm. three central tenets of liberal political economy that I've been talking to you about for the past month. The gold standard, free trade, cheap government. All of these things come to an end with the outbreak of the First World War. Britain comes off the gold standard, it's suspended. Free trade is clearly impossible in the conditions of total war, and cheap government is not a way to develop a war effort. Instead, the state was required to get involved into all areas of economic and social and political life in ways that had been unimaginable just months previously. And it does so primarily through this thing known as DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act, gave the state unprecedented emergency powers for the conduct of war. So, for instance, under DORA, the state assumed total control of the railway system, all forms of transportation. It takes over armaments production, and it takes over control of the purchasing of raw materials and food. It launches an unbelievable war machine. All of the techniques of the Industrial Revolution were put to producing the materials for the war effort. So you see the size of the British military that grows between 1914 to 1918 in terms of the size of the army, up to 2.5 million men, numbers of lorries, cars, the big artillery guns that you saw, and even of aeroplanes. This is a massive industrial effort. And it is headed by a new government department known as the Ministry of Munitions, which was formed in May 1915. And headed up by David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George, who had been the key architect of the new Liberal Revolution and the People's Budget and the introduction of old age pensions and national insurance between 1909 and 1911. By 1920, the Ministry of Munitions employed 20,000 people. That was the size of the entire civil service of all government employees a century earlier, in one ministry. By 1918, 60% of the workforce, of Britain's workforce, was engaged in the war effort, including the large numbers of women in unprecedented numbers. 700,000 women working in the munitions industries, the famous munitionettes, but also another 840,000 women engaged in the non-industrial sectors. What this new control of the war economy meant was that the government, the state, had to find new ways of making workers happy and productive. Okay? The state began to recognize that in order for the war effort to succeed, they had to make workers more productive and more contented. This is in many ways in Britain the beginning of welfare capitalism, the attempt of industrial capitalism to take the welfare of its workers enormously seriously. Compare this, for instance, to the style of management, of scientific management, that came out of the United States in the same era. By 1917, the Ministry of Munitions had developed a whole welfare system. It had welfare supervisors that checked the conditions of workers. It provided housing and hostels for many of its workers, particularly women. Women were put up in hostels. And in order to look after the moral purity of women living away from home or out of domestic service, they set up for the first time a women's police force in order to be able to more effectively police the population of women workers. They also did something, again, pretty unprecedented, which was take responsibility for the feeding of workers and setting up canteens and public restaurants where workers could eat cheaply. So, if the state takes a central place in terms of a command war economy, what it also does is take over control of the area of consumption to an unprecedented extent. Okay? So the state is involved in production in ways it never had been involved in before. Now it's also getting involved in the realm of consumption. And the best example there is food rationing. Okay? Now remember that Britain had become a country at this point largely dependent upon food imports. This was the liberal free trade regime of cheap food. The problem was that the Germans led an incredibly successful U-boat campaign, submarine campaign, to sink the merchant ships that crossed the Atlantic to try and bring that cheap food in from the US and Canada and Argentina. So, prices, as the supply of food went down, prices escalated, and there was a great deal of public unrest about the length of lines, of queues, and escalating prices. And indeed, a whole series of strikes, of industrial strikes, break out in 1916, in large part about escalating costs of food and the inadequacy of wages to cover them. The state tries to introduce a system of voluntary rationing. It says to people, look, we haven't got that much food, everybody has to eat less, act responsibly and we'll get out of this mess. It's a complete disaster. Hoarding takes places, there's utter inequity in terms of who gets food and who doesn't. So by January 1917, the British government does something that it had tried very hard not to do, which was to introduce food rationing for the first time. So by January 1917, the state has complete control of this war economy, of production, of consumption, and of distribution. So that's the war economy. Now, conscription. If part of the central tenets of this liberal political economy was that the state wasn't actively engaged in economic life, that the market would provide its own methods of regulating production and consumption and distribution. So an actual central shibboleth of that liberal order was that the state couldn't tell people what to do. Okay? Now we know that this is a fiction, that people were put into workhouses, that they were put into lunatic asylums, that children were sent to compulsory school. We know that throughout the 19th century the state, far from being small government, was actually often about big government. Nonetheless, the hostility to the idea of a standing army and of the state being able to tell people that it had to fight on its behalf remain incredibly strong. A leftover, if you like, of the conflicts of the 18th century in many ways. So it was important that the British army was considered to be a volunteer army, that people would volunteer to fight. But the scale of the casualties on the Western Front meant that they very quickly were running out of a supply of men. So in January 1916, hugely controversially, the state introduces conscription for the very first time. All men aged between 18 and 41, all of you men, would have been compelled to fight. And by April 1918, the age range is extended to 18 to 51, and critically, because conscription had not been introduced in Ireland. Remember where the rising had been going on in 1916 at precisely this point. Conscription was finally introduced in Ireland as well. Now, the opposition to this was immense. And it came not just from socialist members of the Independent Labour Party, the ILP, were pacifists and were opposed to the entire war effort. They obviously were opposed. It came from the Manchester Guardian, the newspaper most associated with the Liberal Party. And it came from this organisation known as the No Conscription Fellowship. And they're important because they become the mouthpiece for those people who became, after the introduction of conscription, conscientious objectors. People who conscientiously objected to joining the war effort. 16,000 Britons. Again, the point that I want you to get here is just as there's very little desertion in the British Army, so the numbers of people who actually choose not to fight are very, very small. But nonetheless, 16,000 people refuse to fight. About 3,500 of them are happy to support the war effort in non-combatant roles, often, doing medical work on the front line, or transportation, or clerical work. Of those 16,000, about 6,000 are imprisoned for refusing all forms of support for the war effort, and many of them, as you can see in the reading from this week, are subjected to quite harsh treatment in prison. Many of them then go on to hunger strike in protest about the conditions that they face in prison. Being a conscientious objector in jail during the First World War is a little like being a paedophile in jail in 21st century California. It's not a category of offence that you want to be surrounded by other inmates with. Critically, those conscientious objectors lose the vote in 1918. They're the one category of people for whom the vote is actively removed in the Representation of the People's Act. Remember, 1918 is a moment when all men, and quite a lot of women, all women over 30, and some in other classes as well, get the vote. The only people who don't get the vote in this new democratic system is conscientious objectors. They're actively punished for their refusal to fight. Their citizenship is removed from them. The other key role that the state does in terms of its development of the security systems and the handling of security risks was the internment of enemy aliens. Again, this had never happened in Britain until this point. Well, actually, there'd been some of it in the Napoleonic Wars, but this is a totally different scale. The Aliens Restriction Act is introduced in 1914, and by May 1915, the German population in Britain, or German men, are interned. 30,000 German men were interned in May 1915, and their women and children were deported back to Germany. The German population in Britain effectively is half during the course of the First World War, and people like my family changed their name out of fear of anti-German reprisals. Okay? My name is actually not Vernon, but Vernon, okay? which for some bizarre reason, my great-grandfather thought sounded a little too German Jewish. So they changed the name to Vernon to make sure that their paper shop was not attacked by anti-German rioters in the east end of London where they lived. And finally, now, there can be few more intimate ways of thinking about the relationship between the state and its subjects to how it is that death is handled. Death is an incredibly personal, intimate experience for families. And yet, the way in which the casualties of the First World War were treated was profoundly new. Part of the problem was an administrative one, okay? There's a shitload of dead bodies scattered all over the world, okay? And the issue is, how on earth do we deal with this scale of carnage, this scale of mortality? It had once been the case that if you had some money, especially if you're aristocratic and you had a family mausoleum on the estate, you simply paid to get your young boy shipped home and buried in the family mausoleum. Okay? And that was an important part of making families whole in this type of thing. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, and I'm ripping all of this off shamelessly from a brilliant graduate student here, a PhD written here by Andrew Keating, that you can read if you get it through JSTOR, not JSTOR. Anyway, I'll figure that one out by the end of the lecture when my senility will have corrected itself. During the Crimean War, basically, they begin to develop graves in situ for fallen soldiers, and begin to do a fair amount of romanticisation of what it meant to have fallen and died on foreign soil. Okay? But still, there's an enormous inequity of the delivery of death. Some people got graves, some people got mass graves, some people, were still able to be brought home, etc., etc. Well, the state begins to take an increasingly active role in this with the creation of this new organisation called the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1917. And basically what it does is allow the state to take control of dead bodies. The state basically says, look, to families, look, I know he's your son, but we have control of his body, you are not in charge of it. We're going to decide where he's buried and how he's buried. And what they do is try and